Welcome into the D3 Datacast for a midweek. This isn't quite an emergency pod, but there's so much that goes on during a conference championship week that we just couldn't wait a whole week to talk about it. Matt, let's get into it because there's a lot that has changed since we did our Monday episode. So let's talk about kind of what's changed and maybe what's coming up here.
Yeah, I mean, we already talked about how fun of a time of the year this is. We're coming up with this special episode. We're going to have extra special coverage on Sunday. We're going to have extra coverage going into the tournament early next week, multiple episodes. But now let's talk about the bubble picture, Zach. I think that there's a lot of interesting games that have already gone on this week and will come up ahead Friday and Saturday. So let's go through those games.
Yeah, let's start with a little bit of a bubble update. I thought a good place to start here is actually with a couple teams who are done playing already, right? So their final NPI is not going to be determined by what happens, for them on the court from here on out. It's going to be just dependent on which way things move in terms of all the other games being played, right? So one of those teams that's looking in the best shape is Amherst. Their regular season's done after falling to Bates in the NESCAC quarters. But I thought, looking into what our simulations at d3datacast.com showed has been really interesting because it gives some information about how susceptible their at-large position is at the moment. And again, that's due solely to everything else that is going on because they don't have any games being played. Everyone else who is still playing, right, there's some factor in the simulations where they go down a path where they win a game maybe before losing a game. Other ones, just there's games to be played, results that are still to be determined. And, before a game's played, some percentage of the time it's a win, some percentage of the time it's a loss. But that's not going to be the case with Amherst and no games left to play. So looking at Thursday morning simulations that we had at d3datacast.com, those simulations produced at-large cut lines ranging from a minimum of 60.285 to a maximum of 61.850. And that's an average cut line over those 1,000 simulations of an NPI of 60.863. Now, within those 1,000 simulations, Amherst had a minimum final NPI of 61.343 and a maximum of 61.876 for an average of 61.604. Of course, where that cut line is in any given year is going to vary just depending on how crazy the overall picture is, how many bid thieves there are. But we've always said that if you're going to be above 61, that's kind of a good rule of thumb. That's typically in most years going to put you in good position, right? So no games left for Amherst to play, but those simulations are reacting to all the other scenarios it's playing out and giving them something between 61.343 and 61.876. So that maximum that minimum NPI value that we're seeing in the simulations for Amherst is lower than maybe the highest projected cut line, right? But it just leaves a sliver of susceptibility for Amherst. And that scenario probably involves a heavy bid thief situation, plus potentially kind of needing some other micro adjustments that are unfavorable results for them based on maybe teams that were on their schedule.
Yeah, well, and we saw, Ohio Northern lost to Otterbein. That's a team that was on their schedule. So that's a little bit of a negative result for Amherst. But there's so many more games built in, that's not going to change them that much. We've seen that their range is pretty narrow. They're done, right? They're in the clubhouse, and we see their NCAA NPI is 61.6 as of Thursday night. That's not going to change very much. And that's above the typical at-large cut line. I think you're right, Zach. The way they don't get in is one of those extreme bid thief scenarios. Our computer sees a maximum of like 6 or 7. It's going to need to hit that high end if Amherst is going to be in any trouble whatsoever. And I think it was interesting on d3boards.com coming into the week, or maybe into their quarterfinal matchup with Bates, there was some discussion about feeling like the loser of that game was probably out. But that really wasn't showing up in our simulations ever. Those teams were all kind of in the 80s or 90%, even if they lost that game, just with the resumes they had already put together. It's kind of weird at 18-7 that Amherst feels that safe. Their schedule is, I don't want to call it a weird one, but I don't think they had a ton of non-conference strength in there, maybe outside of the trip to Vegas for the D3hoops.com Classic. But they also play in the NESCAC, and they won a bunch of games, and almost all those games are quality win bonus games. So they did put together a good resume. And even though maybe some NESCAC supporters were feeling like they should feel uneasy if they lost that game, we're sitting here. They're above Virginia Wesleyan, they're above Carthage, they're above Roanoke, they're above Elmhurst in the NPI, and those are teams that are on the bubble. And if those teams are to be in at-large position, they have to suffer another loss. So it's likely, Amherst is going to stay above those teams right there, or whichever those teams lose, right? So I think they're in a really good spot. I think they're going to continue to be a really good spot. I would be shocked if they don't make the field come Selection Monday.
Another one of those bubble teams whose regular season at least, is over after losing earlier in the week is UW Oshkosh, right? So it's a very similar situation for Oshkosh. With their regular season concluded, like we just talked about with Amherst. But it's a scenario that's far more precarious just with where they're sitting. So the simulations produced a final NPI range for Oshkosh of 60.346 to 61.110 with an average of 60.753. So within that range, we do see a number above 61, but an average that's below 61. That they're kind of as bubbly as it gets, right? And if you look at kind of the bubble watch odds, they're kind of hovering right around that 50% mark. So really what happens nationally is going to determine whether UW Oshkosh, I think, is one of the last teams in or first teams out. It seems like they're just destined to be right around that cut line, and kind of whether we see a lower bid thief scenario, maybe they are that last team in, as that number of bid thieves potentially creeps up through the weekend. It could be, one of those first, second, third type teams, just on the wrong side of that cut line.
And they've been hovering right around that 50-50 mark in our projections as well. So I think that does show it's going to tip. Is that line just above Oshkosh or just below? That's kind of what it feels like, where it's destined to fall out. And you mentioned the micro adjustments in the NPI number, right? Oshkosh is done, but teams they played are still playing. So if you're a UW Oshkosh Titan fan, you're rooting for Illinois Wesleyan, Maryville, Calvin, St. Norbert. These are teams that you have played that still have games to play, ground to gain. If those teams win games, then your NPI will maybe reach the higher side of that potential, and that might tip you just above. So I think that's really big for UW Oshkosh. You want all favorites to win. You want the other bubble teams around you to lose, and you want those teams who you've played that are still alive to continue to win.
Okay, some bubble dynamics that have been playing out in a couple conferences of note. Let's start with the ODAC, where Virginia Wesleyan and Roanoke both got through their ODAC quarterfinals to set them up for, what the projections right now are showing is very much a win and in type situation in a head-to-head semifinal between those two. Thursday morning simulations had Virginia Wesleyan with a 99.7% chance should they lose in an ODAC final, after beating Roanoke in a semifinal. That was 99.2 for Roanoke, so kind of very similar, kind of plus 99% for either team should they win that semifinal against one another and then lose an ODAC final. And, while it looks like a win and in situation, it's not necessarily a lose and out. Thursday simulations gave Virginia Wesleyan even a 70.2% chance of being an at-large team should they lose that semifinal with Roanoke, while the Maroons look more bubble out, but still at 31.4, so not like completely off the board. So very, very interesting. For sure, looks like the winner of that game could go into that ODAC final and not really feel like they absolutely have to win that game to see their season extended. If I was a fan of Virginia Wesleyan or Roanoke, certainly I would want that tournament championship, because anytime you've got hardware on the line, you want it. But in terms of that added weight of a loss totally ending the season, I think that pressure would be off.
Yeah, and you don't feel great, especially if you're Roanoke, about a potential loss. That 30% feels like it can evaporate in a hurry if one result goes an unexpected direction. And as we record here, it just went final that Wilkes beat Catholic, so that's a likely bubble thief out of the landmark bid thief. Maybe if Drew still wins that, that's probably a team passing a Roanoke. So maybe we've already just seen our first bid thief possibly out of the landmark. You don't want to see very many of those if you're a 30% Roanoke team. Virginia Wesleyan, even at 70, you don't sleep great going into Saturday and Sunday, right, in the finals. if you're at 70%, but you're probably like, I would imagine Virginia Wesleyan ends up in that Oshkosh position, or maybe an Oshkosh plus position. You'd want to stay just above them, right? Not just below them. But Roanoke almost certainly falls below Oshkosh. And that would be, there's kind of a line of teams then waiting to get in, and you don't want to be at the back of that line.
Let's move on to the CCIW. Very similar situation to what we just talked about in the ODAC, with Elmhurst quarterfinal win over Carroll, combined with what maybe looks like a fairly favorable start, at least to the week, in terms of kind of the national scene with conference tournaments playing out. Of course, we know that can change quickly, and with Catholic losing, that's going to definitely be something to see in Friday's simulations, just to see once Catholic is officially out of the mix for an at-large, how that kind of cascades down. But anyway, with Elmhurst win, meeting up with Carthage in a semifinal. Carthage had a first round bye there in the CCIW tournament. That's setting up what the projections we're looking at as basically another kind of win and in type game between those two. Thursday morning simulations, Carthage was at a 94.6% for an at-large, with a loss in the CCIW final, 88.2% for Elmhurst. Again, another one of those where the winner of that game would go into a final with, probably maybe some pressure off. You still looking kind of sub 90% for Elmhurst, but 88.2% looks pretty strong. However, it's a little bit less positive for the CCIW semifinal loser than we previously discussed with the ODAC loser in that Virginia Wesleyan Roanoke game. The simulations Thursday showed just an 11.9% chance for Carthage to get an at-large bid should they lose that semifinal, and then Elmhurst would be in deep long shot territory at just 1.6%. And as we look forward to a Friday update with Catholic losing, maybe that suddenly becomes zero, because that 1.6 was going to need to be a very narrow path that probably was zero bid Thieves plus help.
Yeah, and while it's not purely a win and in, lose and out situation, it's pretty close to that. Like for many intents and purposes, it is that. The winners, even we've talked to enough coaches, like 90%, they're still so nervous about that 10%. So you're going to want to win that automatic bid no matter what. But it is pretty close to a pure. You get to the final, you're probably safe. You lose, you're probably out. So that's going to be a really big, important. That's a high leverage game right there in the CCIW semifinal.
All right, so those are some of the big ones to keep an eye on heading into the weekend. And Matt, I know that you were looking at this a little bit earlier in the week, because I believe you tweeted about just kind of how many at-large bids really are out there, or out for grabs, based on what the simulations were showing. I dug into it myself this afternoon. So let's just kind of go through it. It looks like the NESCAC is safe for 5 at-large bids. So that's going to be 3 of that quarterfinal group between Trinity, Tufts, Wesleyan, and Bates, because one of them is going to win the AQ. The other 3 are going to be in at-large, plus Amherst, right? So that's a 5-bid league. So that's 4 at-large bids right there. The UAA with 3. One of Emory or Chicago will be in via at-large, whoever doesn't win the AQ there, plus WashU and NYU, who are out of the title race but are in lock position in our bubble watch. The WIAC is down to 3 of Whitewater, Stevens Point, La Crosse, or Platteville, whichever 3 of the 4 don't win the AQ there. The ODAC has 2 bids locked up. We just talked about the winner of Virginia Wesleyan Roanoke, being essentially a lock, combined with Randolph-Macon, who's already a lock.
So that's one at-large bid,
right? So that's
guaranteed.
One, right?
Yeah.
Another one out of the coast to coast, Mary Washington or Christopher Newport. CCIW 1, either Illinois Wesleyan or the winner of that Carthage Elmhurst game. The SCIAC has 1, either Redlands or CMS. The Centennial has at least 1, being Franklin and Marshall or Johns Hopkins. The NUMAC has 1, with either Babson or WPI. And then the OAC has at least 1, with Otterbein moving on to the finals and Mount Union being a lock, right? So that was my list earlier on in the day. So that's 17 of the 21 at-large bids, leaving just 4 up for grabs. And now, since I put that list together with Catholic being knocked out of the landmark, I think that's another one that's off the board. So yeah,
18,
you
yeah.
could say that there's essentially 18 at-large bids that are basically spoken for heading into the weekend.
Yeah, and which is interesting because there's still one, two, three, four, five, six, seven conferences that those teams that you read off aren't guaranteed to win the title either. So there's only three bids up for grab, and there's still potentially seven more bid thieves out there, which means that those are the extreme situations that we talk about that turn like a 95% plus into a zero. Is like you hit all of those, right? You hit
Right.
bingo, 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 and that's a bad scenario. Likely a bunch of those favorites will win, or one of Randolph, Macon, Virginia Wesleyan, Roanoke wins, and that's kind of not a bid thief. So a lot of those situations will go relatively chalk. But yeah, we're maybe looking at what are those three teams. So that's where if you're UW Oshkosh, if you're the CCIW, the third team in that group, or you're the third team in that ODAK race, you're really hoping for all favorites because you're really running out of bids. And that's why we've seen maybe that what I called a thinning bubble a couple of weeks ago in our show. There's not a lot of teams in that bubble in, bubble outside because there's just not very many bids that are still up for grabs at this point based on the NPI scenario.
So let's turn our attention from the bubble to just some of the other outlooks that we're seeing in the projections. Let's start with the top eight. Of course, that's very important to finish in the top eight of the NPI. Those are what are considered the protected seeds in the bracket. If you're in the top eight, you're guaranteed to not have to face anyone else in the top eight until a potential quarterfinal. Those eight would have to all be in the final eight to see any of the others. Okay, and so based on our Thursday simulations, Trinity, Connecticut, Emory, Chicago, Randolph, Macon, they were in that top eight 100% of the time. They're locks. Now, St. Thomas, Mary Washington, Tufts, Wesleyan, and Christopher Newport all have top eight odds in Thursday morning simulations that exceed their computer odds to win the conference tournament. Now, what that tells me, Matt, is these are the teams, if they win the conference tournament, they can expect to be in the top eight, right? If they do something that that seems like they have a little bit lower odds to do, or then that other thing that had higher odds should be a given, right? Now, what's interesting about that, though, is there's some multiple some teams in the same conference in that list, right? So only three from that second list can actually win their conference tournament because we got multiple contenders in that group from the coast to coast and from the NESCAC. So if you take that group of four that are locks and then weed out multiple appearances from conference in that second group, that kind of seems to me to leave one spot in that top eight up for grabs that doesn't win their conference tournament. Maybe it's a C2C runner up, maybe it's a NESCAC runner up that holds on to it. But at that point, there's also going to be a challenge from a Montclair State should they win the NJAC tournament, from Endicott should they get through the CNE tournament, and then some trace chances for a couple other teams. But really, between the locks of Trinity, Connecticut, Emory, Chicago, Randolph, Macon, the challengers of St. Thomas, Mary Washington, Tufts, Wesleyan, Christopher Newport, and then kind of the additional challengers of Endicott and Montclair State. Those are the most likely spots where those top eight seeds will go.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me is like Tufts and Wesleyan, they appear right next to each other in our projection view, and they almost together add up to 100%. So it almost feels like one of those two. Now they don't play each other until a potential final, I think, in the NESCAC. So it's not as simple as this, but it almost feels like whoever finishes higher of those two in the NESCAC maybe gets that top eight spot. The other one doesn't. That's an oversimplification, but that's starting to feel how the percentages play out in those types of kind of interconference races.
All right, so let's talk top 16 here, Matt. This is something I've been tracking, and it's a dynamic, very, very reminiscent of what we talked about, I believe, last year with the NJAC, where we had four pretty even teams that were all in pretty solid position. Right. And so coming into play Friday, the simulation showed top 16 odds of 35.1% for Whitewater, 26.9% for Stevens Point, 22.4% for La Crosse, and 0.3% for Platteville. And, those odds don't look great when you think about them individually, but collectively, if you just add them up, that's about 85%. So, really the lack of kind of impressive individual numbers just comes down to lack of clarity as to who's actually going to win the tournament, right?
Yeah.
But it's the kind of situation where if you do look at it collectively, I think the expectation should be that whoever wins the WIAC tournament is probably going to be in that top 16 percentage or top 16 position. Now, it looks like actually maybe if Platteville were to do that, maybe there's just too much ground for them to make up, and they would be, maybe just on the outside of that. But again, none of those individual odds are even 50-50. But as we get through the semifinals here on Thursday night, in that Friday update, expect to see kind of the winners kind of collecting the odds of the losers, and
Yeah.
I think that's going to really trend toward a top 16 position for a WIAC champion.
Yeah, it's not exactly 1-to-1, but for Stevens Point, La Crosse, and Whitewater, their AQ odds, so the odds of winning that conference tournament, almost exactly matches their top 16 odds. So it feels like if one of those three wins, that team is top 16. If it's UW Platteville, then maybe none of the WIACs end up as top 16.
All right, Matt, similar dynamic for top 16 odds for Redlands and Claremont Scripps as we just talked about in the WIAC. Not quite as strong of a dynamic as we saw there, but especially if we get a Redlands CMS final, that will give a really good final game boost to whoever can win it. That's one of the things that I think kind of gets overlooked or isn't talked about enough about this path that a team ends up with through a conference tournament can really lead to some of these little micro changes, because if you get an upset, well, suddenly that next, playing the team that got it, advanced through on an upset may not give you the kind of boost if you beat them had that upset not occurred, right? So I think probably especially for top 16 odds in the SCIAC, those teams are going to really want it to be a CMS Redlands matchup to provide that biggest possible final boost and possibly vault over maybe like a Hood, who is also kind of in that that bottom of the top 16 challenger position, that may not be able to add a win as strong as a CMS or Redlands beating the other one of those two.
Yeah, and that dynamic is probably more true for Claremont Mudd Scripps, who's a little bit behind in NPI right now. They probably need that game against Redlands to vault them up into that top 16. If they played, if it was an upset, they played Oxy or gosh, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head who's the third team is still alive in the SCIAC.
Chapman.
Chapman, yes. They're good teams. They will give you good NPIs, but not as good as Redlands would have, right? So that maybe is more true for CMS than it would be for Redlands.
So things can get dicey for teams on the bubble. So let's talk about Bid Thief conferences. And we've got a list here separated by kind of the pure Bid Thief, where there's only like one team that teams on the bubble are going to want to see. Let's start in the CNE, where there's an obvious, just one team, and that's Endicott. Endicott is a lock to be in as an at-large should they need it. That conference does not have any other at-large contenders. So pure Bid Thief potential scenario should Endicott not win the CNE tournament.
And I feel like this is a good time to call out the fact that just because in 1,000 simulations we've been seeing like a 7 Bid Thief maximum, that's not the true maximum right now. If we ran 100,000 simulations, we'd probably still get scenarios where there's 10, 11 Bid Thieves, no matter how rare it is. And the CNE is one of those that could happen. Endicott looks like a huge, big, strong favorite. Whether or not they win it out, like we have to see.
Yeah, you talk about 6 or 7 as the max showing up in the simulations, but we've got a list here of potential Bid Thief conferences that's much longer than 6 or 7. It's just the odds of, every single one of these turning into a Bid Thief is pretty astronomical. But these are the conferences to keep an eye on. Next up is the Landmark, which, I mean, officially I think we can call it a Bid Thief conference at this time with Catholic losing. Drew was showing up on our bubble watch with some level of odds, but my feeling on teams like that is, if they were to win a conference tournament and finish kind of in that at-large range, it's because they were able to finish without a loss. Had they taken a loss, they probably would be on the wrong side of that bubble. I don't know, Matt, if you kind of agree with that, take on Drew's chances.
Well, I think Drew's chances, that means they did show up as at large sometimes, but that was probably playing Catholic
a very
in a
narrow
final
scenario
and losing, and then also having almost no Bid Thieves,
right.
Things like that. So it was probably, like as you say, very narrow. So it's, again, if Catholic's the only bid thief and Drew wins it all, maybe you don't say that this is a quote unquote bid thief conference, but it's the closest thing to it for all intents and purposes. It's a bid thief conference already.
Right. All right. The Met Commonwealth, pure bid thief conference with Hood. The MIAC, another pure bid thief with Gustavus Adolphus. Right. A lot of bubble teams going to be wanting to see Hood go through, to see Gustavus Adolphus go through.
More teams that are playing kind of as we record this, right? Gustavus is playing, so things could change by the time this episode drops already too.
Okay, let's talk about the NJAC, Matt. That's a little bit of a similar scenario as the Landmark, where on the Bubble Watch, TCNJ is still kind of showing up with odds. My feeling with that again is that it was pretty narrow scenario where should Montclair State not win here, I think this is still basically kind of a pure bid thief conference, but another one to keep an eye on, even with TCNJ kind of showing up at the fringe on the Bubble Watch.
Right, and it'll be interesting to see. Saturday is that NJAC final between TCNJ and Montclair State. So they've already reached it. We know it's those two teams, but it'll be interesting to see, like, as of Friday morning, Saturday morning, what do the percentage odds say for TCNJ? Like, we think we have one bid thief already, which are not updated in our most recent odds. So that will change Friday morning. Will be interesting to see when those are posted, kind of about the same time as this episode. What does that actually look like for them?
Absolutely. Things change rapidly and sometimes drastically, right? So always going to be paying attention to, any of the updated numbers we're able to push through to d3datacast.com. All right, a couple more just kind of pure bid thief conferences. The SAA with Trinity, Texas looking super solid. That's kind of an interesting one, though, Matt, because there Rhodes is the 1 seed, and they were 2-0 in the regular season against Trinity, Texas. And then in the SCAC, St. Thomas went through the regular season in that conference 16-0. The only real tournament contender there. So a bubble will burst should someone other than St. Thomas win the SCAC tournament.
Yeah, and the SCAC plays, I think, Friday, Saturday. I guess they haven't
Sunday
started
final. They have a Sunday
till
final.
till Friday either. So it'll be like Friday, Saturday, Sunday to get that 16 tournament done. So that whole conference is just going to pack it in.
All right, let's expand the possible bid thief conferences to conferences that, kind of give some or scenarios for teams on the bubble. Starting with the coast to coast, we talked about it a little bit earlier. Mary Washington and Christopher Newport are tournament locks. So as long as one of those teams wins the coast to coast conference, nothing for anyone on the bubble to worry about. The CCIW has Illinois Wesleyan as a lock, and we talked about that Carthage Elmhurst winner looking safe. All right, so there's a guaranteed winner, a guaranteed loser in that mix with Carthage and Elmhurst. Illinois Wesleyan's a lock, right? So that really sets up North Park as the fourth team left in that tournament to be the potential bid thief. So in the CCIW, as long as North Park doesn't win that conference tournament, things are looking good on the bubble. Centennial Conference, the teams on the bubble are going to be wanting to see as long as Franklin and Marshall or Johns Hopkins wins that one. But another interesting dynamic where Gettysburg is the 1 seed, but they are an AQ only team, and they will get F&M in the semifinals, right? So with the way the seeding works out there, Franklin and Marshall and Johns Hopkins are both locks, but neither is the 1 seed. But it's not like they're even the 2 and 3 seed and gonna be matched up in a semifinal, right? So we could have a Franklin and Marshall Johns Hopkins final that the bubble can sit back and enjoy and not have to worry about who wins that one. In the NUMAC, it's an or situation with WPI or Babson. No bid thief as long as either one of those wins. The OAC, anyone other than Mount Union or Otterbein winning the OAC conference tournament would be...
Update, Zach, here. Heidelberg has beaten Mount Union, so we're going to have a Heidelberg-Otterbein final.
All right, so the bubble is officially rooting for Otterbein in that OAC final. Sky kind of talked about the dynamic there. As long as Redlands or Claremont Mudd Scripps wins that conference tournament, that's not going to really change the bubble outlook. And then another one we've talked about here, the ODAK with Randolph-Macon being a lock, Virginia Wesleyan and Roanoke winner being essentially a lock. That sets up Hampton-Sydney really as the only kind of potential party spoiler for anyone on the bubble in the ODAK conference tournament.
So I distracted myself with that Mount Union loss. So that probably I don't want to say kills, but maybe kills their top 16 odds. It helps Hood's top 16 odds and hosting odds, just thinking of geography. It probably helps the WIAC's top 16 odds as well. So that's maybe the cascading effects that are going to go on there. And we talked about some of these but possible Bid Thief conferences. Like our projections have the coast to coast. Christopher Newport or Mary Washington, one of those two winning 99% of the time in the coast to coast. That's pretty big. In the SCIAC, either Redlands or CMS, 90% of the time that one of those two teams wins. Chapman and Occidental do have odds there, but it's not as overwhelming as those other two. In the Centennial, that if it's either F&M or Johns Hopkins, that together are probably 60%. So that's probably more than half of the time one of those two wins. That feels pretty safe. Well, not pretty safe, but like better than 50-50. Illinois Wesleyan, Carthage, or Elmhurst, that it's one of those three, that's probably like a 90-95% odds by our computer simulations. So that's when we talk about the narrow path to these being like Bid Thief conferences. Like everything has to go right. But as we saw in the OAC, Mount Union lost. Otterbein only won by 2. So we were this close already on Thursday night to making the OAC a Bid Thief conference, and it still might be, but one of those favorites is just still alive now.
All right, so that's kind of setting the stage heading into the weekend. Hopefully that's helpful, but really the most up-to-date kind of day-by-day outlook is going to be found at d3datacast.com. You can head to the homepage there, go to the top of the screen. There's a little NPI drop-down where you can find the the current NPI rankings based on games played to date. And then we also have the projections page where you can see the bubble watch view. Scroll down a little bit down below that, and you can see kind of the full projections, right, for every single Division III basketball team, and that's where we were pulling some of those kind of minimum NPI values, maximum NPI values based on what the computer was seeing in those 1,000 simulations.
And thank you so much to our Patreon supporters. They're the ones who provide the funding for us to be able to host the website, put the data on there. If you'd like to join as well, patreon.com/D3Datacast for either the $3 or $5 a month tier. Thanks everyone that has joined that. It's been so fun. This is a fun time of year, and we love posting these numbers. We're the data cast after all.
All right, stay tuned to d3datacast.com. Find us on all of that social media garbage at D3Datacast, and we'll see you later this weekend as we get closer and closer to having a tournament field.
Good job, team.